All right, we should be good to start. So welcome everyone to day two. Principal argument with Ahsan, our guest trainer. I'll pass the floor to him.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to my second session under the WoLCE Open Day Workshop slots. And today I will be doing principal arguments. Before we move on into the explanation of what principal arguments are and when do you use them, how do we construct them, I think the first thing I want to note is what do I think of principal arguments and how do I approach them? And the first thing I want to note here is I always think of principal arguments as a way to package whatever it is you're trying to fight for on your side. So all the benefits, whatever benefits it may be, whether it be to the rest of society, whether it be to the economy, whether it be to global international relations, I think of principal arguments as a way to package all those arguments under a single direction that your side is intending to take. And now this will become much clearer as we move on into the lecture, but I just wanted to get that noted first. The second kind of disclaimer that I want to put out is that you don't have to run principal arguments all the time. Sometimes motions just require us to argue on a basis of benefits and compare that to the harms. And that is a possible way to win a debate as well. Although a principal argument can come in handy, especially in the context of possibly British parliamentary debates where you are stuck thinking of extensions, or even in an Asian parliamentary debate where you are just trying to think of a nice introductory argument to the rest of your case. But the TLDR will probably be only run it whenever you feel like it is necessary, whenever you feel like it is able to help your side in proving something that's meaningful and that can be kind of helpful to you in winning the debate. Let's then move on to the agenda. I think 5 components of what I intend to cover today is firstly, what are principal arguments? Secondly, would be a comparison between utilitarianism and key ontology, which are the more common principles. Thirdly, we're going to look at virtue ethics and how that differs from the usual principles that we are probably more familiar with. Fourthly, we're going to look at common principles and basically things that you can steal in the construction of any principles for any related motion. And lastly, then we're going to look at the construction of principal arguments themselves, like how do we execute it within a speech, within a case, how do we make these arguments to begin with, what is the general structure that we need to follow. Let's then move on to the first agenda, which is what are principles? And the easiest way to understand what principles are is anything that does not rely on an outcome. And that is why there are a few words, there's basically 3 prongs here to prove basically the same thing, that principal arguments are non-consequentialist, they are outcome independent, and they are not for a benefit or the prevention of any particular harm. They are an encapsulation of all these things as a package. And to simply understand this is to consider the following question, and that is, why do charities exist? Most of the times, the answer that we get when we ask this question on why charities exist, we are likely going to get the answer that we see on the right side, which is to help people. Charities exist because there are people that require help, there are people that are currently suffering, and charities, what they do is they alleviate that suffering, whether it be to financial aid, whether it be to getting them necessary goods, etc. Although that isn't necessarily what a principle is, because if you realize the outcome, which is to help people, is an outcome, right? It's a benefit. So that isn't necessarily a principle. What then do we say when someone asks us why charities exist from a principle perspective? Now, there's no one right answer to it. There are multiple answers from a principle perspective to why charities exist. But let's look at 3 in particular. And I want to talk about these 3 in particular because I would say that they are quite common principles as well. Firstly, when we look at social responsibility, and now this has some similarity to the idea of a social contract, which basically says that the members of the society cooperate with each other and their rulers, and they sacrifice certain rights in order to get other benefits. But this isn't so much about the relationship between people and their ruler, but it's more of within society itself, people and other people. And that is what we say when we talk about social responsibility, that there is a sense of responsibility that members of society owe to other people. That when we talk about even the social contract, it kind of talks about how people are intertwined within a society, and why the sacrifice of any particular right isn't just so that we receive a benefit in return, but it's also so other members of society are able to enjoy that same level of benefit as well. Now, that is for the idea of a social responsibility. And as you can see here, we're not really talking about a benefit. It's more on the fundamental principles of which society is founded upon, like the idea of a social that is derived from this particular contract in relation to how people should interact with others. Moving on then to
Okay, I think we should be back. All right, give me a second.
Yes.
Maybe start from here.
start from here. Okay. Okay, yeah, so we had some problems. I'm just gonna go back and explain certain things. So starting off with the fundamental question on what principles are, it's mainly the idea that it doesn't focus on an outcome. So there are three prongs here that essentially push to the same idea, that firstly, principles are non-consequentialist. They are secondly, outcome independent. And thirdly, then that they're not for benefit or to prevent a harm. So what this just means is that principles don't necessarily look at what we are able to get out of something, but it's more of why do we do something in the first place. So to simply understand this, let's consider the following question, and that is, why do charities exist? Now, a lot of times the answer that we're going to get when we ask this question of why charities exist is going to be the answer on the right hand side, which is to help people. But that is why I made this graphic for everyone to understand the order of which principles need to exist in. So the order of which it needs to exist in is not so much on the right side. We're not looking at what is able to do when it exists. We are looking at why this particular entity exists in the first place. So it's not about helping people. It's not so that we are able to alleviate suffering, like what charity organizations are, like what they are able to provide a benefit for when we talk about society. It's more so on the left-hand side. Why do they exist in the first place? Now, there's no one right answer to why charities exist, but let's look at three in particular that I have that I put into the slide here. Firstly, is on the idea of a social responsibility. Now, what this principle basically looks at is that there is a responsibility that every member of society has onto other individuals that exist within the same community as them and within the same society, under the same government. Now, this is similar to the idea of a social contract that basically says that there is a responsibility for people in terms of the relationship that they have with their rulers in sacrificing certain personal or certain individual wants and probably even at times needs that they have in order to get a better, in order to, for example, allow for other benefits to be procured by the government. I would say it derives from that similar principle when we talk about social responsibility, but this basically says that there is a responsibility onto every other member of society to sacrifice these benefits, not just so they are able to benefit on part from like other policies that the government provides onto them, but also so other individuals are able to live lives that are as equal as them. And some examples of policies or things that we do that can be derived from the idea of a social responsibility or a social contract is taxation, right? When we pay tax, there is an understanding that what we are doing may not necessarily benefit us like in the most proportional way. So just because we pay $1 million in tax, that doesn't mean we're about to receive services from the government that's valued at $1 million. A lot of times the tax goes into other, social programs like welfare, like public education and public healthcare. So basically the way that we can look at charity is just a voluntary form of taxation, right? Whereby taxation is kind of mandatory and an obligation on part of being a citizen of a country. When we look at charity, that's more of a voluntary way that people can provide for their country and to the people of their country through like social programs. Moving on then to the second principle that we can possibly derive, and that is on altruism. Now, I just want to add a disclaimer before we talk about altruism, that it is not enough for me to give a speech which has a principal argument that talks about altruism and to just say that, humans, we have kind of an innate need to be altruistic and we have an innate need to be good, and that's why charities exist, and then I conclude the principle. Now, that's not going to cut it, right? Especially in pushing certain principles that are quite evident, in principles that are quite intuitive. You need to be able to explain this principle in a way that properly encapsulates whatever it is you're saying. And what I mean by this is to weaponize, and if you watch like the workshop yesterday, I talked about weaponizing rhetoric. And this is one of the instances where you would probably want to weaponize that level of rhetoric to be able to explain principles in a way that is really persuasive. So it's not just that there's an innate need for humans to be altruistic, but this has to be coupled with what are instances that humans behave in altruistic manner even when we're not required to. And we can draw to instances like in times of crisis, where oftentimes religious institutions take in people even though they are not of the same religion. In times of crisis, neighbors come together and they pool together money in order to help other members of their community. So these are all altruistic instances that we can see people behaving even when they're not required to. And this is a possible principle as well, that when we can explain that charities exist as a result of the innate need of people to kind of be altruistic, even though not all the time, but at times we behave in a way that pushes that displays altruistic tendencies, means that charities are a natural birth of that tendency that we have as humans. That is on altruism then. Moving on to the third idea or the third version of a principle that we can have to support this question or to answer this question of why charities exist. And it's one of my most commonly used principles actually, and that is on the idea of a state failure. And what we talk about when we say state failure is basically the idea that governments are imperfect, right? That there are going to be gaps in public service, that there are going to be people that are unaccounted for, that don't have the privilege of benefiting from programs and policies that the government plans for or the government executes. So in the instance that there is a gap, and then the instances that state fails in protecting the lives of its citizens or providing for their citizens, that's where charities come in. And what they exist for is to fill up these gaps, is to reverse the state failure. And that is why it leads to the outcome of us being able to help people. But to answer the question of why they exist in the first place is because of this failure, because of this imperfection that's on the part of the government in providing certain services for their people. Now, I think that just after this example, it'll be pretty easy for you to understand what principles are. But it's all about the way it is being presented and whether or not it is in a way that proves or shows the importance of why this principle exists. Because I think a lot of times the trap that speakers run into in talking about principle arguments is that these principles just end up being very non-contentious, that the judge is left there thinking, okay, I understand this and I get what the speaker is trying to say. I just don't see the importance of why this needs to be in the argument. So that is why the way in which it is being explained or the way in which it is being presented needs to talk about why there is a principle problem that currently exists, or what kind of principle is being adhered to by your side that requires attention or that needs to be seen as something that's important. So the impacting of this specific principle is something that's really important in proving the importance to tell the judge why this is something that they should care about in the first place. Now, where do these principles come from? They come from all around us, right? They come from society, they come from law, they come from religion, they come from philosophy, right? And they are mostly based on like unchangeable morals of society. And this is when we talk about ideas of fairness, ideas of freedom, ideas of rights, the right that people have to things like privacy, the right that people have to things like opportunity or equality. And this is where a lot of times principle comes from. And whenever you are stuck in the debate of trying to think of a principle, just think of what is an unchangeable moral that can be related to the side that you are currently assigned to in the debate, or in terms of the motion, what is an unchangeable moral that we can see is related or can be branched to this motion. So I think that is an important consideration that we can make whenever we are trying to find or whenever we're trying to understand where these principles come from. But it's basically all around us. We can derive any principle from just looking at how systems work around us, how they operate around us, and look at what the fundamental ideas or the core working idea of these policies or of these systems are, to understand what the principle that they are operating on. So let's then move on to a comparison of utilitarianism and key ontology. And these are one of the more common principles that I feel can be read in any debate if you really can properly extract the principle from it, and if you can properly package everything, then you can run utilitarianism or key ontology in almost any motion. Now, to understand what these principles are, utilitarianism is basically a consequentialist philosophy. What it says is that the most important consideration in doing anything is to maximize the amount of benefit for the greatest number of people while also minimizing their suffering. So this looks like getting the most amount of it's okay, we'll go into examples later, but let me talk about that deontology. Deontology is I wouldn't say the exact opposite, but it doesn't put so much consideration or importance, or doesn't really prioritize that outcome as much as it prioritizes or emphasizes on the actions that are taken in attaining that outcome. So it's more about the morality of the actions that are being taken. So a very easy example would be idea of this trolley problem, right? And I didn't put the usual trolley problem, I put a meme here. And that is to talk to you, and that is to explain to you of how there is no right principle, right? That this person here is replying to his dad that he genuinely doesn't know if he's winning. And I think that is the principle, right? That there's no one right answer. There's no one size fits all principle. That it all depends on the context and the nuance of the situation and how we do it. And what the trolley problem basically says is it's a pretty long problem. I don't get really into it. But on one side, there is like 5 people, and on the other side, there's 1 person. And basically, this train track, this train is going down this track and it's bound to hit these 5 people. And it's asking you the question, would you pull the lever so that it also, would you pull the lever to redirect it to hit that 1 person? Now, if you were a utilitarian, you would say yes, right? You would pull the lever because instead of killing 5 people, you only kill 1 person. But someone who is a deontologist is going to look at the situation and say they'd rather not do anything because pulling the lever means that they end up being complicit, that it doesn't matter what this train was going to do, but the fact that you are now involved in it means that you can be considered a murderer. And there are modified versions of the trolley problem that just kind of tests how far you're willing to go in pushing, because like the usual consensus is that obviously you would pull the lever, right? So like there is kind of a utilitarian bias in society, but there are multiple modifications towards the trolley problem, multiple versions of it that just try and push how far that utilitarian tendency of human beings tends to go. So that is the idea of a trolley problem, and that is the basic illustration of the comparison between utilitarianism and deontology. Let's look at other examples of utilitarianism and deontology there. Now, this might give you a better idea of how it's being applied in like different aspects of society that we are familiar with. Firstly, in healthcare, utilitarianism might prioritize the overall health and well-being of a community. And this might be through like mandatory vaccination programs in order to prevent the spread of disease. Deontology, on the other hand, might prioritize the ability of the patient to make a decision, so their autonomy and rights. So they might say, like mandatory vaccination programs are not preferable. We need to prioritize an individual's right to make their own medical decisions, even if it goes against the public good. So that is a difference that we can see. Okay. What about politics then? Political situation or in politics in general, a utilitarian approach might talk about or might advocate for policies that benefit the majority of the population. And this is when we talk about taxation to fund social programs, to fund public health programs, etc. But a deontologist might prioritize on issues pertaining more towards individual freedoms. And this looks like the freedom of speech, the freedom of privacy, even if it means that it results in some level of harm and inequality. What are other examples? In business, a utilitarian approach might outsourcing jobs to other countries to reduce costs and increase profits. Now, in the first page, you will realize that you find yourself maybe aligning more with utilitarian principles, right? Given that they talk more about the benefit. But under that same principle is when we see instances of businesses engaging in things like exploitation of foreign labor, where they pay foreign labor low amounts of wage because they're able to, and this can lower cost and increase overall profits. That is a utilitarian outcome that we can see when people engage in business. What does a deontologist then say? The deontologist might say, what's important here is not really profits, is not so much on the cost, on the idea of reducing costs, but it's on the fair treatment of workers and the protection of their rights, even if it means that it comes at lower profits. So here's where we see deontology being more relatable in terms of common morals that we tend to hold as human beings, of protection of migrant workers, protection of labor rights, and making sure workers are well paid and well treated. We can see deontology edging over here. Another example that we can also understand is in terms of the criminal justice. And this is when utilitarianism probably advocates for harsher punishments for criminals. And they would say that this is so it is able to deter crime and that people are, that we can push people away from committing crimes in the first place because we can use fear as a deterrent. That when we advocate for really harsh punishments, things like capital punishment or the death penalty or really long prison sentences, people are going to be scared to commit these crimes in the first place. What a deontologist says, on the other hand, is what criminal justice needs to prioritize is the fair treatment of accused individuals and the protection of their rights, even if it means there's some level of risk to society. Because what deontologists might believe in is that there is an innate right within each individual human, regardless of if they have committed a crime, that things like justice and things like the process of following the rule of law are important things that we need to maintain and important things that we need to preserve in the journey of trying to get the best form of justice. So it's not just about protection to society, it's also about the protection of individuals who have committed these crimes in the first place and a fair treatment towards these individuals. Let's then talk about virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics is slightly different than ideas of utilitarianism and deontology, right? So there is a meme on the right side that there's people arguing about what deontology, which principle is better. And what virtue ethicists believe in is to just be a good person, right? So when we look at other principles like deontology or utilitarianism, they focus more on external rules that we have set up on ourselves as a society, whether or not we need to prioritize the benefit, whether or not we need to prioritize the action that we take in attaining that benefit. The core difference here is virtue ethics says none of that is important. What is important is that we just be good people. Now, what does it mean to be a good person, right? And this is by the most simple idea and definition of being a good person, right? That we develop virtuous traits, traits of honesty, courage, integrity. These are all ethics or principles that virtue ethics kind of believes and holds closely, that an individual would be the best moral agent at the point at which they avoid themselves from or prevent themselves from committing or engaging in vices, so anti-virtuous traits. And when they develop or they commit themselves into developing more virtuous traits, traits that are seen as favorable, traits that result in people being treated in a better way, traits that make you an overall good person, right? Now, the question here might be, what is a good person, right? Like being good is such a subjective idea. Like, how do we decide when we need to be honest, right? Because even the ideas of honesty, when we look, obviously we would tell people to be honest, but we wouldn't tell someone to be honest when a murderer comes knocking at their door and is asking where their mother is, right? We'll tell people to be courageous, but we don't tell people to be stupidly courageous. So yes, you should be courageous and you should be brave, but that doesn't mean you should run into a burning building with no training of being a firefighter and trying to save people from this particular burning building, because that isn't just endangering yourself, that's also endangering other people. So we can understand from this that it's incredibly subjective, but it's all about context and it's all about nuance. So obviously when we place some of these traits into certain contexts, they can be seen as unfavorable traits and they can be seen as unfavorable characteristics to have given the nuance. But that is where we need to paint the context, that when we are trying to push the idea of virtue ethics and why being this kind of a person is a good thing, we need to talk about why, given the situation or given the context, that the development of these virtuous traits are somewhat preferable. So we need to build and illustrate the environment around the actor and why the environment around the actor shows why being a virtuous person is something that's preferable. And we can also talk about other, more practical, even though we say that principles are not really talking so much about outcome, but we can derive certain benefits from being a virtuous person as well, like the building of good interpersonal relationships, having a lot of friends, people like you, and that feeds into our ego, right, of wanting to be a virtuous person. So we can tie being a virtuous person to the human being to be perceived as someone good as well. And why? Because as humans, we don't want to be seen as a bad person, because being a bad person is going to affect not just our ability to build good relationships, but our opportunities as well in the future. Versus if I'm being a good person, I'm going to get more opportunities because people like me a lot more, and that's going to feed my ego of wanting to be seen as a virtuous person. So that can also be a principle that you want to talk about. Let's look at then common principles. Now, I'm not going to go through every single principle every single motion that these principles can exist for, although I'll just highlight a few. Now, reparations is a pretty common principle, and that is when we talk about how we are able to reverse or kind of compensate minority communities and victims for injustices that have been committed towards them. So this can be applied in motions that talk about the creation of a black secessionist state in the United States, or why we should pay reparations to women. And when we talk about reparations, we need to prove that there was a harm that was committed and why it is not possible to reverse or to compensate for this harm in other ways, that we can then use whatever it is the motion is trying to push as a means of reparation. But you can also run a counter principle on the opposition to talk about why maybe there are better ways to get these reparations, or why this isn't a legitimate way to get reparations. Because is it really reversing the harm? Is it really compensating for it? Are questions that an opposition can ask towards any model that the government is trying to prove that reparations can be derived from. Moving then into responsibility. Now, responsibility is a very all-encompassing principle. There's a responsibility on almost every single agent or every single kind of actor that exists in society. The responsibility of parents, your responsibility as a student, the responsibility of a doctor, the responsibility of an entrepreneur, right? So there are multiple, different kinds of responsibilities, depending on the roles that you have assumed in society. And that is why it is very easy to run a principle argument about responsibility. Let's look at certain examples here. This house believes that minority parents should encourage their children to aspire to be the model minority image instead of combating existing stereotypes attached to the community. And this is when we can talk about what is the responsibility of a minority parent, right? And that is what is going to be in contention in the debate. And if on government, you would want to say the responsibility of a minority parent is to make sure that their child can be an inspiration to the rest of the community and to inspire other members of the community to also be a good model minority, someone who is really successful, someone who is really able to be independent and financially liberated or whatever, being a front leading individual in society. And on opposition, what you are going to say the responsibility of the minority parent is to combat existing stereotypes attached to the community. And you're going to talk about why stereotypes probably affect every single member of the community, and why this responsibility of combating existing stereotypes can be more utilitarianism in nature. Sorry, not utilitarianism in nature, utilitarian in nature, right? That at the point at which we say, as a minority, and we teach our kids and minority kids to combat existing stereotypes, this isn't just something that is able to benefit them, but it's also something that is able to benefit the rest of the minority community. Versus maybe on government, where from the opposition perspective, you would want to paint their benefit as something that's only maybe more accessible to more privileged minorities. So minorities that were able to break out from the cycle of poverty, minorities that were able to, experience additional levels of privilege compared and relative to the rest of the community. So that is an example of a responsibility that we can talk about. Let's then, another example here is on this house would allow companies to include a clause in their employment contracts for women where that woman legally agrees not to get pregnant. And the responsibility in contention here can be talking about what responsibility does this woman have towards the company versus maybe the responsibility that the women has towards, I don't know, her family, or another version of that can be the responsibility that the company has towards to the woman. So on government, you would probably talk about why, when you are a member of, or when you are an employee for a company, that the responsibilities that you are able to fulfill are kind of diluted when you, I don't know, agree to get pregnant, because you are physically impaired, you need to take a lot of off days, you need to be paid at the same amount, even though your output might not be the same as other employees. So that can be talking about the responsibility of like employees of the company. Versus on opposition, you can talk about why maybe number one, it would be more irresponsible to not let women have children, because if you as a company tell them that they can't have children, then you're unlikely going to get women who want to work for you. And that is even if a company doesn't prioritize having a diverse workforce, that is going to be a bad look on the company, and that is going to result in the company, I don't know, not getting favorable perceptions from the public. So that is how we kind of can impact principles into even a practical outcome, although you don't want to elaborate on that practical outcome as much as you want to talk about why the principle exists in the first place. Just war, and just war is basically a principle that tells, or that is basically a principle that basically encompasses why war needs to happen in a way that is moral, and that only exists in the instances of military necessity. So there are multiple prongs to it, but you can argue this in many different ways, especially in a lot of war motions, based on what strategies that we should take on in engaging in war, and whether they are aligned with just war principles, of war only happening, or conflict happening in a way that is morally necessary, and only when there is a military kind of urgency to the entire situation. Bodily autonomy, which I'm pretty sure everyone here is well aware of, the right that someone has to onto their body and what they can do with their bodies. And you can talk about this in this house would ban cosmetic plastic surgery. This house would legalize the sale of human organs. In the last time when you had motions that that were more towards like fundamental bodily autonomy, when we talk about abortion, when we talk about allowing people to transition, although we don't really see these motions as much anymore. Nowadays, we usually run bodily autonomy motions more so for like gender motions that talk about whether or not maybe a woman doing something is practicing bodily autonomy, or is it bad for their bodily autonomy, those kinds of questions, although you can still use it if you see instances of these motions. Democracy is also another principle, and basically that is something that we believe in as society. Democracy is seen as something that is undoubtedly good, that we can't really say democracy is bad, because what we're doing is giving the right people to choose who their leader is, and giving the right people to decide how they want to see their country and how their country turns out in the future. And it's very easy to prove why democracy is important, especially because people are affected by it, and people who are members or citizens of a country kind of have an inherent right to decide how they want that country to be run and how they want the country to operate, because they live in the country and they are directly affected by any policy that's being made by said governments. Moving on to two other principles. That is number one, on liberties versus security, or human dignity. And here is where we make comparisons, right? So principles don't necessarily have to be isolated in the sense that we are only talking about a singular principle, like the principle of democracy or the principle of responsibility or whatever. It can also be a comparison. And here is where we can make those comparisons when we talk about liberties versus security. So would we allow the use of torture, even though it can allow greater security? But the very fact that it takes away human liberty, or takes away the liberty of people to not be tortured, then is that like what is how do we that deadlock over that? So that is a way that we can talk about the contention. Or secondly, this also prioritize intelligence gathering over the right to privacy, or emotions or like any motion that supports increased surveillance. So whether things like the Patriot Act, do we regret those things, or do we see those things as things that can be seen as necessary, policies that can be beneficial, right? Is security to be safe from things like terrorist threats, or making or preventing instances of terrorist attacks more important than people being able to live lives that are not surveilled on by their government, where people are able to preserve the right to privacy that they probably hold very dearly to themselves? Or is it okay to say, you know what, these rights are not important, we should make sure security is something that's even more prioritized, would probably be the question. The last common principle that I want to talk about is when we talk about the pillars of justice. And this is obviously for criminal justice motions, where you're always going to talk about what are the prongs of the criminal justice system. And here is where we talk about retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, reparations, or victims' justice. And these are usually the primary considerations in a criminal justice motion. So it's always about comparing these pillars of justice, which is more important, retribution or rehabilitation. Where should resources go into? Like, do we allow for judges to significantly exceed normal sentencing guidelines in order to fulfill maybe more retributive parts of the criminal justice system while lowering ideas of rehabilitation? Or do we say that judges need to follow the guidelines that have already been set because, like, I don't know, criminal justice or like the law needs to be fair? So regardless of whatever it is that you are fighting for under pillars of justice, you need to prove why that is the primary consideration that you're making in your side of the debate, whether in the whatever prong that you choose to prioritize. Usually the contention is between retribution and rehabilitation, whilst the others will be kind of complementary prongs of the criminal justice system. But it would be helpful if you did a lot of reading into why retribution is important and why retribution is good, but also on why rehabilitation is important and rehabilitation is good. So regardless of whichever side that you are assigned, whether it be one of a retributive nature or one that talks about why rehabilitation is important, you kind of know and you can, like, you understand how to push for these ideas in a way that can frame these things as being more important than what the other side is fighting for. Let's then get into, lastly, the construction of principal arguments. Now, I think a lot of times when people say they understand what principal arguments are, they don't really get it yet, because you still see instances of people running principles the wrong way, where they will do the same mistakes that I talked about earlier in this workshop, right? When you talk about altruism and it just says, yeah, people want to be good and we can supplement their need to be good with charities existing. No, that's not going to cut it, right? Firstly, and this is the general structure that you would want to have towards making a principal argument, is what is the principle or right that you are defending? And for example, the principle or right that I'm defending is the principle of state failure or institutionalized assistance, which is basically the same thing. And what is the analogy or intuition part when we enshrine this principle or right in society? So we have to give examples, we have to show precedents of when this principle is kind of, when we kind of have this principle, right, in society, when we see this principle happening. So in the idea of state failure, the very fact that states give tax breaks to things like religious institutions and to charity organizations means that the state supports instances of other organizations or other entities existing to account for gaps within the public system. So that shows that this is a principle that is being enshrined when we talk about institutionalized assistance, or whether it be state failure as well, that the state recognizes that there is a limit to the ability that they have in providing for people, that there are going to be gaps in the public system and social programs. So that is why these entities or these organizations, these institutions need to exist. And then we explain why is it the same, right? And that's very simple. Charities also help people that probably require help, and individuals who require help are usually people who wouldn't have access to jobs in the first place, people who probably don't have access to opportunities and to services like healthcare or to education. And that is why it is the same right that we're kind of defending. And we can show the similarity of instances in both these things. And you can also use this as like more analysis to support why state failure is something that's prevalent, and basically illustrating the group of people that is being failed by the state and why these are people that need to be helped by things like charities or NGOs or whatever it may be. Lastly, then, is to talk about why this principle is important or impactful. Now, it is like an important consideration to note that the impact here shouldn't be done in a lazy way, where a lot of times speakers just say, the reason why this principle is important is because now we're able to help people. When you do that, that just kind of dilutes the entire principle argument, because now you're relying on that outcome. You're relying on the outcome of these charities being able to help people, or these organizations being able to help people. You're not trying to push a principle importance here. Now, how do we then push a principle importance? I have that question a lot of the time as well, right? Like, what is the importance of this principle? It's kind of hard to explain why we need to account for state failure. But the simple way, and this is a foolproof method to approach impacting principles, is just a summary, right? Just summarize your principle to say, panel, that what we have proved within this principle is that there's a necessity to account for instances where the state fails in preserving and fails in protecting certain rights that people have. And this is why charities need to exist, because we need to make sure that there is equality of not just the way of not just the benefits that people, or there's an equality of not just the lives that people live, but the benefits that they are able to extract from society, from things like taxation, from things like charities, from things like other NGOs and other organizations that are meant to supplement instances where the government fails. So just by doing that, you're able to show why this is an important consideration or why this is an important principle. And I would say that always conclude your principles, do not just leave it hanging, because like I said, the trap that people run into a lot of the time is principles and like being non-contentious. So always spend a bit of time in trying to prove why this is an important principle, even though by like doing the analogy and by talking and by giving the analysis to talk about why this is a true principle and why this is in fact a way that we live our life is all most of the time already sufficient in proving the impact. You would always want to still end it on explaining very explicitly why this is something that you preserve and why this is something that you fight for on your side. And that is the end of the workshop. Are there any questions?
I've got one actually.
Okay.
So it's like, Asian circuit has a bit of a bias for utilitarianism, right?
Yeah.
So it's like emotions like the privacy versus security debate. If God argues things like the ticking time bomb theory, like we know that there is a bomb that is like somewhere we need to violate people's privacy to do that. How do you weigh the right to privacy to be more important than potentially beneficial outcomes?
There's a really good workshop by this on the way. There's a really good workshop on YouTube on this, and it's about like 8 ways that you can break utilitarianism. So usually it's hard, right, to respond against utilitarianism. That's why you don't try and fight against utilitarianism and try to push Key Ontology. Like that shouldn't be your only strategy, right? You should always try and enter the debate with other benefits of like privacy and what people are able to do much better when they enjoy things like privacy. So maybe they trust the government even more, they cooperate more with national policies that are able to ensure more instances of security. But there are ways that we can break ideas of utilitarianism, and there are 8 ways. I can't remember every single way. But I think one of the things that really stuck with me is asking the question of whether it's an egregiable benefit. right? A lot of times utilitarianism tries to group benefits together and makes it seem like this is going to benefit everyone at the end of the day, right? So even when you talk about the ticking time bomb, is it something that we need to violate the privacy of every single person for in order to prevent that time bomb? Is a question that is valuable to ask, right? Or do we only need to make sure that some measures exist in order to prevent instances where a time bomb is ticking in somewhere that the government doesn't know about, and why we need to prevent these things from happening? So it's asking these questions, whether it's an agreeable benefit, whether these are situations that are even related to one another, whether people giving up their right in this area really ensures benefits in other areas like what the government is trying to promise. Because if you realize a lot of the times utilitarianism is quite simplistic in nature, it tries to group everything together and paint it as you will enjoy all these benefits if you give up all these things, when those things might not really be true. Those might not really be accurate. So it's really about breaking the truth value. But like I said, it is very hard to argue against utilitarianism. So the main tip that I have is that if someone is trying to argue utilitarianism, don't argue against it, right? Just don't argue against it. What you should do is try to argue more like different benefits that is also utilitarian in nature, but probably more focused towards, like, I don't know, the privacy, the utilitarian nature of privacy, and why privacy is something that's important. So try and then fight and argue over which side is more utilitarian, and try and claim that utilitarian label for yourself. Because yeah, we have utilitarian biases. I wouldn't say just in the Asian circuit. I think a lot of times in everywhere, like globally, people have utilitarian biases. So always try and be the side that is utilitarian. But if you can't, then you can explore different ways of trying to break that utilitarian link that is holding the other team's case together. All right. All right. Okay. Thank you everyone so much. I've had a great time, and I hope that this was a helpful workshop for you guys. Thank you. I'll see you all.
Right. Thank you so much, Ahsan, for coming all the way down from Penang to run this workshop. And yeah, I guess we can end it here. Let me just end the stream.